So this is to look at, various types of research, or, let's put it this way, various types of techniques that we use to primarily gather data or information. So when we look at this, in that the first part was looking at academic competencies. The second part is now focusing on what is research. So let's look at some basic terms here, which is to understand what is research first. So let's look at the textbook definition of research. When I say, sometimes you might work in an office, and to give you an example, you might work in the office, or you might work in an environment wherein somebody, maybe like a supervisor or somebody in your team might ask you to say, your boss might ask you to say, could you look up and book, a suitable venue for Christmas, party this year. So what your boss has actually asked you to do, or your manager has asked you to do, is basically at some stage, he has asked you to look at finding out, suitable venues wherein the staff of the company or the organization could, host a Christmas dinner. Now, this involves a couple of things. The first thing would be that you would probably at some stage, he's given you a task, but at some stage, this requires you to look at doing a bit of a background search to find out what are the venues, what are the costs. Is it a 3-course meal, 5-course meal, 6-course meal? Do you want to have some entertainment? You might look at having some questions. Now, when you are looking at finding out relevant information, which is relevant for this particular task, that would mean that at some stage you are going to undertake a process through which you will get hold of this information. And this process, through which you ask some questions like, your boss would have said, Christmas dinner, okay. Then you go back and say, okay, boss, I've found out a few locations, but do you want to go in for a 3-course meal? How many people are going to attend? Is there a set specific budget per person? Do we want that to be a lunch or a dinner? Will you want some entertainment? Will drinks be included? These are things that you're asking him in terms of questions, so that you can effectively find out and book a venue to achieve that task. So what is all these set of activities, which is the Q&A session and the additional information that you're seeking, is primarily aimed at finalizing or booking a venue, for the, booking a venue for this Christmas dinner. So here, this process that you undertake to primarily find out this information is nothing but, something called research. You're going into doing some investigation or going into finding out some information, which can only be done if you ask a few set of questions, or, collect some data from various places. You take some quotes, you go to some websites, and then basically compile it together into some sort of a short report and then provide it to the person, and that would help accomplish this particular, task. So from that point of view, this process is called research. So the very nature of the subject, which helps you kind of determine whether this information is relevant or is irrelevant, would be classed as, something called research. Now, research can be of different types. So when I look at research, sometimes you will look at, deductive research, and sometimes you will look at inductive research. Now, we will get into something called the research onion. This is a particular, let's put it this way, this is a particular, wholesome picture or a complete picture of how the research is actually carried out. So why do you do research? Why do you gather information? Why do you look at doing an investigation? Why do you look at finding out data from different sources? Now, the reason why you do this is because you're trying to get to an answer. You're trying to find a solution to a problem, or you have a problem, but you want to investigate it to come up with logical solutions, which are possible, and they can be used then from time to time and again to, solve those problems. So in this case, what we want to do in the learning outcome 2 is find out the types of research, why they are done, how they are done, and we'll kind of, fall back into something called the research onion, which basically looks at defining the various stages in which data is collected, information is gathered, and then at some stage you come out with meaningful conclusions to say that this is the reason why this is there, or this is the reason which is not there, and because of which, this has happened. So we will look at this as a concept in a bit more detail, and what we want to be able to do is focus on understanding how this is carried out, what are the different types, and then why is it required when you are looking at level 3 in journal. So when we look at this, research that we want to do, so here when we look at reasoning or deductive research, these are steps that you normally take in order to come out with some sort of a meaningful conclusion. And sometimes what you have to do is also test the situations using hypothesis. That means if I say 1 plus 1 makes 2, but how do you test that it makes actually 2? Why is 1 plus 1 not 11? So what you have to do is you have to create some sort of a test situation or a hypothesis in order for that to be tested as an experiment or as a solution to say that yes, this actually works or this actually makes 2. And in those cases, that type of research would utilize both inductive and deductive stages. Now, this particular learning outcome is much more theoretical, unlike learning outcome 1. Here, some of the aspects and the areas of research is what you need to understand. And some of these slides which are put together primarily tend to be, talking about giving you insights into the different types of research and also, on different, areas of research which sometimes are taken in order for us to arrive at meaningful information or to a solution for a problem. Now, if I look at the research onion in general, that is where I would need to focus on. Now, in general, if I look at explaining in very brief detail this particular learning outcome, what you will see is that research is of 2 types, primary and secondary. Primary is when you actually go out and collect data and you do the research firsthand. Secondary is when you look at collecting data, information from various sources which are already in the published domain. That means it could be on the website. It is an information which is already available because the event has already happened. And that is where it differentiates between the 2 types of research, which is primary and secondary. Now, when we look at collection of data also, that is why we can also differentiate that sometimes when you look at differentiating between what kind of research you're going to do, is it going to be something, let's look at if you're going to be investigating something, like for example, sometimes you see on the tellies that, if you're watching say fiction or any sort of a movie, you see that there is a bit of an investigation which happens on a murder or on a particular situation wherein, the detective would go in and introspect and look at recapping or recollecting what are the sequence of events which has led to this situation. So in this case, what you see is the information is already out there, the thing has already happened, and then you're getting into a bit of introspection to find out why this has happened, how this has happened, and could this be avoided from happening. So in those cases, because you're going to go and now ask the people firsthand about the situation, any witnesses and things like that, you are doing primary research because you're getting in touch with people to find out about information. But if this is an investigation which was done 10 years after the initial incident has happened, then at that stage you would primarily start off with already a published report or things which are already in the domain, which means that articles or news or any form of report which has already been published. And if you are looking at further doing analysis and interpretation of that report and then get into finding out further details about why this happened, how this happened or occurred, is like a secondary research, because what we're trying to do is collect more data or analyze more information on the information which is already present now in the public domain or in the published domain. So they tend to be reasons of doing what is called the secondary research. Now, the other way that we also classify research would be that we classify research in terms of what is called the qualitative and quantitative research. So when I say qualitative and quantitative, as the name itself specifies, when I say qualitative means you're going to get into factors or data which is related to the main aspects of research, and quantitative means numbers. So when you look at quality versus quantity, that is where you'll also look at differentiating between different types of research. So sometimes it tends to be quality research, and sometimes it tends to be qualitative research, and that has also been, explained in terms of situations of why sometimes you have to do qualitative research, and in sometimes why you have to do quantitative research. And in some situations, you have to do mixed methods. That means you will look at both qualitative and quantitative research. So they are called quant and qual. So you will carry out and analyze data from both angles, and that tends to be a mixed method that you need to look at. So this particular learning outcome is focused on understanding the various types of research methods and why and how do you use some of these in typical situations is what you have to understand. So this would look at basically your learning outcome 2, which is more theoretical and is more geared into understanding the reasons of why research is carried out, what are the types of research, how do you differentiate primary from secondary, and towards the end, the distinction activity talks about picking up examples, in terms of understanding that why is this a method a primary research or a secondary research, and there's another one which is tertiary. So I'm going to do a bit of a small quiz, which is to identify whether you understand, is this the primary source, which means the first source, is this the secondary source, that means this is information which is already published and you're looking at it, or is this a tertiary source, that means more than one form of source is going to provide that information to us. So let's identify these different sources of research that we do by taking a small quiz. So all you have to do in this is, I'll show you a slide and you have to tell me whether that's primary research or primary data, secondary data, or tertiary data. So primary data first hand, secondary data, so you get from other sources, and tertiary data when you get data from multiple sources. Is that okay?
Yes.
So let's look at, now this is a portrait or a picture. Now is this a primary data, secondary data, or tertiary data? What do you think is
tertiary? Do you think it's tertiary?
Well, in tertiary, it would mean that, this is, so if you look at details like persistence of time, so it is actually showing time in different, situations, different clocks, and this is like a bit of a, a portrait or a picture. So this tends to be, primary data, because this painting would have been made by the author at some point in time, and this has not been replicated. So this is the only source of data that you get to see, which the painter would have made, and he's made that in 1931. So he's made a painting, so that's why it's primary.
Okay.
Now, when you look at the autobiography of Anne Frank, is this like a published novel or a book? What is this, a primary or a secondary?
Primary, because it's just hers. Is it?
Well, this will tend to be secondary because somebody here is narrating their lifetime story, and then the publisher is actually, the writer is writing it, and then the publisher will publish it. So Anne Frank is dictating her lifetime memories to a particular person, and because she has experienced it firsthand and now she's explaining it to a writer, the data becomes secondary, because the second person was capturing. Now, this is a small kind of a classified advert, which was probably published in 1665 or 1666. Now, if you're watching this now, or you're looking at a copy of this now, is this primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Primary.
Well, this is primary because this was published at one point in time, and this is talking about a particular situation at that point in time, and that is why it is primary.
Right.
Correct. So what is this? This is a bit of a advertiser's poster, which is an almanac, and it was published in 1875. So you're now looking at it from a point of view of looking at it now as a poster. So is it primary or secondary?
Primary.
This will be primary and also tertiary. Now, why is it tertiary? Because if it has been reproduced over the years, And because it is from 1875, you could have seen this on an advert, you could have seen this on a website, you could have seen this printed somewhere else. And because it is now available as a source of information in different forms on different channels, that is why it could also be tertiary. It could be primary when it was actually first published and you noticed it, or you bought a magazine, or you bought that yourself, then it would have been primary. It's more tertiary. So this particular novel of Anne Frank, which is published in 1942, is this primary or secondary?
Is this her own writing or is it narrated?
Well, we are looking at a novel, which is a published book by Anne Frank. So she was a writer and she's publishing her book. So is this primary, secondary?
Primary. Oh, shit, yeah.
Yeah. Now, this is a chart that you're observing, which basically shows some changes in, how energy prices are moving over a period of time, from 1965 to say 2010. So what is this, primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Primary.
Primary. Okay, the reason why is it primary is because you're seeing it as a live chart.
Yeah.
And it is providing you, some sort of, this is a chart taken from a stock exchange, so obviously, primary from a monitor. Now, history of television. This is a book which is about world history. History of television. Is it primary, secondary, tertiary?
Is it secondary?
That is correct. It's secondary. And let's look at a website, which is a website, a screenshot of a website. Is it primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Primary.
So when you look at a website, the information is already available on a magazine or could have been published, and this is now putting information across at a different point in time. That is why it will be secondary, not primary.
Okay.
Now, if you were to look at a BBC website wherein the breaking news section is being looked at, so as the news is breaking and you're reading it, you are looking at it as a primary source of information because you're getting it firsthand. But if you're listening to a radio and you're basically driving in the car and you're hearing that news, that could be secondary, because in that case, you are not at the scene, you're not seeing it live, but you're only hearing it. So that would become secondary. But if that same information is to be published in a newspaper and you pick up the newspaper the next day, like there were a couple of days back, some series of stabbing in the Manchester Arndale Centre, and you didn't hear about it, you didn't read it in the news, but you picked up a newspaper the other day and you were then reading it, then that source would become, or that source of data would become tertiary data. Okay. Now, you see a couple of newspapers rolled up. Is this primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Is it primary?
Well, when I said newspaper, it is mostly going to be secondary, because the newspaper is printed the next day. So you are going to see information or news about or things about which have already happened or have happened in terms of, in the past time. So that is why the information becomes, secondary. Now, in some cases, it could be tertiary, because if you're picking up a newspaper from the newspaper stand and it's a 3-day-old or 4-day-old newspaper, then that information now would have maybe available on a website, on other forms of printed medium like social media and other bits, and that in that case would become secondary. But if you're the editor of the paper, and when it is going to printing during the midnight hours, and you're as an editor picking it up to cross-check and proofread it, and then it goes into production, then in that case that would be considered primary. So a newspaper would be all the three types: secondary, tertiary, or primary, depending on when and how you would get information from this source. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, this is a stack of magazines. Is it primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Is it all of them?
Well, it's a stack of magazines, yes.
Yeah. The first one.
These are all magazines.
Primary.
So when you look at this, they tend to be primary for the reason that if they are being introduced in the current month. So if you are picking up a magazine which is in October and the October month is on and it's a monthly edition, it will be primary. But if you're picking up something which is from a previous month like September and you're picking it up, then it might become, secondary, because you're in October. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, this is a handwritten note, by, say, the president to Elvis Presley It was handed over to him, by the American Airlines, in probably in 1960s. What is this? Primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Secondary. Because it's not.
So in this case, because it has been written by Elvis and it's in his own handwriting, first hand. Primary is first hand. You're writing Elvis Presley. I'm Elvis Presley and admire you and have, whatever respect for you is written, and he's writing it himself. It is his own handwriting. That's why it's primary. But if he had said this, and an air hostess would have written this, or somebody else would have written his message, it would become secondary.
Yeah.
So now that you're aware, there are different types of sources from which you collect data. So primary are original sources, anything that you can touch, feel, something which has been done by you directly, or is something which has been narrated by you directly, or you have access to that material directly in terms of original materials. That is primary. If you have secondary data or data coming from secondary sources, this would be sources from which you will generally see an account of information has been written with the benefit of hindsight. That means the event would have happened and then you're writing about the event. And the tertiary source are when the information has been distilled or collected from a variety of sources and has now been made available, maybe in a very concise or filtered manner, or it might be available in multiple channels at any given point in time, then that information or information source would be considered a tertiary source. Okay. So this is what was covered in the second learning outcome, which will essentially allow you to understand the types of research, why do we do research, what is the different definitions of qualitative, quantitative research, primary research, and tertiary research. Okay. Now let's